While the U.S. economy was booming and Americans were absolutely enthralled with the new things they could buy, there was a cultural revolution taking place at the same time. The culture of the 1920s is absolutely fascinating because it is what establishes the culture of today. So the Gilded Age, it's kind of the economic benchmark for what the United States becomes, the world economic superpower. The 1920s, though, that marks the benchmark for what American culture will become. The changes that we see during the 1920s are revolutionary. And with revolutionary change, there is always a backlash. There is always the people that are excited about innovation and change, and then the people that think it is society in decay, it is morals, values going completely down the drain. And the cultural battles we see of the 1920s are ones that should seem very familiar because they are very familiar. So, in order to understand the cultural changes that make up the Roaring Twenties, you must understand all of the parts and how they came together, coalesced, and interacted with each other, and how they all tied together. And the first thing that overlay all of this was Prohibition. Prohibition, again, was passed during World War I. It only passed because of World War I. Everyone sacrificing the need for grain and also anti-German hysteria made the Prohibition movement into a sign of patriotism. Are you a patriot, or are you a patriot for Prohibition, or are you for the Germans? So it became almost a litmus test. Prohibition is an example of what happens when self-righteous certitude combines with demanding conformity with the rest of society. It is the government telling all of society what they cannot do for their own good, based on the beliefs of one group. Well, not just one group, but prohibitionists, people that were against, or they're for prohibition. It was a single-issue group, and single-issue voting groups, they just have a lot of power because they only focus on one thing, and so they can put a lot of pressure on politicians. Again, it is a case study in what happens when one group thinks that they are so right, they can force that onto everyone else. And it should stand as an example of what not to do, because it is an unmitigated failure. But again, as I mentioned before, we don't actually learn from history, because if you squint really hard, you will see we don't prohibit alcohol anymore, but we still adopt the same belief system. When Prohibition passed, it passed in 1919, went into effect in 1920, and what it really was a godsend for crime. It is a case study of national hypocrisy at its very best. From the very beginning, no one followed. Well, there was a couple years where there was a decrease in alcohol consumption, but then it just skyrocketed. And everyone was breaking the law. When I say everyone, I mean there were speakeasies specifically for police. There's speakeasies for politicians. Politicians were drinking. President of the United States, Warren G. Harding, was drinking multiple times a week. But there were also just like little grandmothers, 80-year-olds, who had their little toddy every evening that were still drinking. So what it turned into was just a godsend for crime. This is the heyday of the mafia. And it acted as a gateway to other crimes too. Because if drinking is a crime and everyone is committing that crime, then what's wrong with other crimes? So there were a lot of speakeasies that also, like, it would lead to prostitution in some places. There were the attempt, or just the law itself and its flagrant disregard, led to all sorts of other crimes. And it was, when I say flagrant disregard, it was broken by all sorts of people. The person that is considered the father of national prohibition was actually a Texas senator named Morris Shepherd. Morris Shepherd, he was the father of national prohibition because he was all gung-ho for it, and he was kind of the spokesperson for it. And just a few months after prohibition passed, they found a distillery on his property that was making about 130 gallons of alcohol a day. This is the father of prohibition. When they found him, they're like, "Hey, what's going on?" He was like, "Oh my gosh, someone's brewing liquor on my property. How dare they?" I mean, it was just the level of stupidity in this period of prohibition was insane. But the really important thing to understand was, if you lived in the 1920s, what you would be convinced of was it was just riddled with crime. Because it was riddled with crime. Since everyone's breaking the law because it's really a dumb law, then there really was just tons of crime. So it is not like it's people's imaginations. If you go back and read the newspapers, you would assume there's just crime everywhere, because there was. It would be like today if we outlawed coffee. Would people stop drinking coffee? Of course not. It would just mean everyone would be criminals. So that is overlaying all of this. It is this, there will be a lot of people that will keep pushing for prohibition and saying, despite all evidence to the contrary, insisting it's working, even though it wasn't. But what it's really leading to is rampant crime. Just a fun fact for you. If you live in Denton, Texas, there's a place called Fry Street. It's where everyone goes to get sloppy drunk. It's named after a guy named Jim Fry. Jim Fry was a sheriff during the 1910s and 1920s for Denton County. So he is the guy that was responsible for arresting people for drinking. And now he is named, we honored a street after him. And it's where we all, or I don't, but where people go and get drunk. So if you are of age and you are having a drink on Fry Street, make sure to tip one back for good old Jim Fry. So, first you have prohibition. You also have women's suffrage. And put more broadly, you had a women's liberation movement. When I say women's liberation, this is for women. It was one of the most liberating decades. They got all sorts of new rights and they had all sorts of new freedoms, and they just felt liberated. For one, they had the right to vote. That was, even for women that didn't vote, all of a sudden now they had a political voice, and so they were excited about that. So just having the right to vote made them feel free. But there was also a huge part of the women's liberation movement was an increase in women's sexual activity. And this came about for all sorts of reasons, but a big one was women started getting access to birth control. Now, it will not be completely legalized till later, but there was a huge push for women to have control of when and if they have children. Abortion wasn't the big issue, it was birth control. It was illegal for people to have birth control unless they were married. Try to make sense of that. One of the people, or the person that pushed it most, was a woman named Margaret Sanger. No woman can call herself free until she can choose consciously whether she will or will not be a mother. Margaret Sanger, she had been a nurse, and she worked in very poor areas, and she saw how difficult having multiple kids could be. So she will push the birth control movement. She is actually jailed multiple times. And she was actually a eugenicist. She thought that they're working in her career, she thought there were certain people that should not be able to have kids. So not only was she a eugenicist, she also wanted to give women the right to choose whether they were going to have kids or not. And she will be the founder of the American Birth Control League. This is to promote birth control. It will change its name in 1947 to Planned Parenthood. So she is a very controversial person, obviously. So you have a women's revolution, a sexual revolution. And on top of that, in the census of 1920, for the very first time, the United States was officially an urban nation. When I say an urban nation, 52% of the population lived in urban areas. And the definition was like urban areas, a city with 5,000 or more, I believe, at the time. So more people were living in cities than rural areas. So it was a huge, huge change. We obviously had been urbanizing before, but this is when officially we became a majority urban nation. And that sets the tone for the trend that continues to this day. Now, the only reason we became a majority urban nation was World War I. A lot of people started moving to cities for the jobs in factories. And one of those groups were African Americans. There was what's called a Great Migration. More than 1 million African Americans, for the very first time, left the South for jobs up north. A lot of those, when U.S. soldiers went overseas, a lot of companies actually sent people down to go recruit African Americans to bring them up to the cities. So this is when blacks started moving to New York, Chicago, and other places up north, and where factories were in huge numbers. The Great Migration was the biggest movement of African Americans, especially out of the South, to that time. And they moved in huge, huge numbers. Related to that, too, was the beginning of black nationalism. Black nationalism, it was also called the New Negro Movement. And it was a movement to promote black rights and black pride. And it manifested in all sorts of ways. Something called the Harlem Renaissance, which unfortunately we don't have time to go into. But what black nationalism was just black pride. A lot of it was also the black servicemen who thought once they had come home from fighting in World War I, they would be treated well, and they weren't. They were treated terribly. So that obviously really pissed them off. The black nationalist movement, though, parts of it went to extremes. And especially the part that was led by this guy right here, a guy named Marcus Garvey. He is the founder of what is called the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And Garvey, he will promote black nationalism to the point that he will call for African Americans to move back to Africa. So he says that, well, remember, whites don't want us here, we don't want to be here. So he will push this idea that blacks should actually just separate themselves from whites. Like W.E.B. Du Bois, we talked about before, he wanted blacks and whites to be together or work together. Garvey, he and Garvey just could not stand each other. So Garvey, he takes a extreme position of black nationalism and black pride. Ironically enough, he will meet the head of the KKK, and the two got along better than he got along with W.E.B. Du Bois. Garvey would say, well, at least they're honest. And also, both the KKK and Marcus Garvey, they wanted blacks to all go back to Africa, so they actually agreed with each other. So there is a huge movement of blacks into cities. And as we talked about before, during Jim Crow, one way they learned to survive in it is they created isolated communities. And in those isolated communities, they created their own culture. Well, now they're bringing their culture up into cities, up to these cities. And one of the most important parts of their culture that they will bring to the cities is jazz. Jazz is a blend of African and European traditions that is characterized by improvisation. And jazz music is like a lot of African American music is defined by the rhythms that are especially good to dance to. And so it will lead to all sorts of carefree new dances like the Charleston and things at the time that were considered so scandalous. But this absolutely enamored a lot of people. And there were a lot of people, especially, as you would guess, young people, who thought that this was just great and the music was great. And obviously, African Americans, since they were the ones that had brought the music up, they were hired to play at speakeasies. So now you have blacks playing their new music, jazz music, in speakeasies where people were dancing carefree dances, and it was, of course, had to be interracial because of that. And so it was considered very scandalous for the time. Think of jazz at the time of what we think of twerking now, where a lot of people find it very. A lot of people don't like it. We'll just put it that way. So you had all of these things coming together at the same time, and nothing better represents all these things than the Flapper Girls. Now, need to be very clear about something. This is the minority of a minority of a minority of the population. Flapper Girls, it is not like most women were flappers. We're talking about a small part of the population, but they gained so much attention. They became just iconic. And they will call themselves the new woman, the woman that was eager to exercise all of her new freedoms, to revolutionize all the manners and morals and throw them off and just completely embrace all the changes that were taking place. And they embraced it in all sorts of ways. One, their fashion. They dressed completely differently than the norm. They rejected traditional forms of fashion. Their skirts came higher and higher. It doesn't even compare to what we have now, but for the time it was scandalous. They bobbed their hair. They wore a lot of makeup. They're called flappers because of the way they would wear their goulashes, their like shoes for the rain, and they would not tie them, so they would flap. But their fashion was very upsetting for some of the older generation because it demonstrated loosened inhibition. But what really upset a lot of older generations were their actions, because they behaved in ways that women just weren't supposed to behave. They smoked, they drank illegal alcohol, they danced to jazz music in interracial clubs, they drove cars, and they discussed sex openly. This is the period Sigmund Freud had come out with his theories, and that was a big part of it, is the open discussion of sex. And premarital sex in the 1920s did go up. So it's not like it was just rhetorical. there was an increase in premarital sex. What this also meant was a revolution in marriage. Marriage fundamentally changed in the 1920s. Throughout most of history, marriage was basically a business contract between two people that were just trying to survive. Well, during the 1920s, that will change. 1920s is when marriage starts becoming about love, support, and companionship. It is about marrying someone because you are passionately in love with them. This is when romantic love, or marrying for romantic love, gains ascendancy. And conversely, naturally, there was a rise in the divorce rate as well. Now, even back then and even now, you will hear people say, see, when women get more rights, they get less happy, and that's why there's an increase in divorce. That is not accurate. They were already unhappy. It's just now that they felt they had the power and the ability to leave intolerable, unhappy marriages. Before this, they just kind of, lived with it. So there were just massive changes taking place all over society. And obviously, for a lot of people, for a lot of young people especially, this is incredibly exciting. It's incredible. For women, it was incredibly liberating. For blacks, it was incredibly empowering. But you can see how, from a macro sense, if you're just looking from a bird's eye view, there are a lot of numbers that would concern anyone. There is an increase in crime. It's because of a dumb law, but still there's a massive increase in crime. There's an increase in divorces. There's an increase in premarital sex. So there were a lot of things that people had. There were a lot of things that just scared a lot of people, which will lead to a backlash. Think of it like this. Whenever there is, and this is not an American thing, happens all over the world, whenever there's a group that has the majority of the power, whether it's political, economic, whatever, even just social power, when they have the most of the power and other groups start demanding more rights, there is always an attempt to suppress that. And that is what will happen. There will be a conservative backlash to all of these changes taking place. So the revolution the Cultural Revolution taking place, it was very exciting for some people, especially young people and people in urban areas. And naturally, there was a backlash. There was a backlash by people that just, whenever there's a lot of change, there's always part of the population that does not want that change to happen. And the backlash against it was people that said morals and values and culture of the United States are going down the drain. Now, it is a conservative backlash, and I have had someone say, why do I have to call it conservative? Two things about that. One, conservative, by its definition, means maintaining the status quo, trying to keep things the same. So that's part of the reason, but the bigger reason is because they called themselves conservative. So I'm not putting that on to anyone. That is the term that's the term that they used. And the groups and the conservative backlash, they disliked all the change. One thing they really disliked were cars. For some reason, they thought they were like roving sex wagons. If you saw a man and a woman in a car, and they were either driving to have sex or they're coming back from having sex. It was very upsetting for a lot of people. And in general, though, they just disliked all the disruption taking place. And so it will come in three forms. First, nativism. During World War I, there was a huge decrease in the number of immigrants that came into the country. And then as soon as the war ended, as Europe was destroyed, the floodgates just opened. And in 1 year, 1919 alone, more than 800,000 immigrants came into the country. So it was just massive, massive influx. And most of them came from Southern and Eastern Europe. So those parts where they were either Catholic, a lot of them were Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. So every time there is a big influx of immigrants into the country, there is always an outcry, whether it's the Irish and the Scottish and the Germans in the 1830s, 1840s, created a whole party, the Know Nothing Party, 1890 or 1880s, 1890s, and 1920s was a big anti-immigrant move. And the arguments were, they're changing American culture, they're changing American religion, and of course they're criminals because immigrants generally tend to be poor and move into poor areas. There was such an outcry by such a big part of the population that Congress acted with one of the strongest anti-immigration laws in U.S. history. It was passed in 1924 called the National Origins Quota Act. This decreased the number of immigrants that were allowed into the country to only 150,000. So that is a huge drop. And not only that, it said that the 150,000 that are allowed into the country, they must be based on their national origins or what country they're from, according to the census of 1890. That's before we started getting a lot of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So essentially what it did is make it so of that 150,000, 85% of them had to come from Northern or Western Europe. The largely Protestant areas, the immigrants that they said represented the country culturally more. It completely cut off immigration from Asia. So it was a huge, huge decrease in immigration from Asia. Ironically, it didn't even mention the American hemisphere. So one thing it led to was an increase in immigration from Mexico and other South American countries. But it was a massive, it was one of the most stringent anti-immigrant laws, and it will only be added to. One reason the United States did not take in more Jews before the Holocaust happened is because of the immigration acts that were passed. There's a later one called the Johnson Act, so it legally restricted the amount of immigrants that could be brought in, that could come into the country. So there was nativism, and there was also religious fundamentalism. Now, the religious fundamentalism of the 1920s, it took on a new militantism, and it was less distinguished by a new set of beliefs or a shared set of beliefs in some sort of faith or something about some theology, rather than it was based on a posture of hostility to other belief systems, especially evolution. Evolution became the target, and the anti-evolution movement was led by this guy right here. You probably thought you were done hearing about William Jennings Bryan, but this is his last hurrah, as you would say. He had run for president 3 times. He was a phenomenal speaker, and he couched all of his speeches in democratic and religious terms, and he will lead the charge against the teaching of evolution, and he will work to try to ban the teaching of evolution, and he has several successes. Well, as the leader of the fundamentalist movement of the 1920s, they have some successes. They are able to get the teaching of evolution banned in several states, including Tennessee. Now, when it was banned in Tennessee, there were a lot of people that said this is unconstitutional. So, with the backing of the UCLA, their biology teacher in Tennessee intentionally broke the law. He taught evolution, and he was fined. When he was fined, the UCLA paid for his legal fees, and it went to court. In one of the most famous court cases of the decade, the Scopes trial, sometimes called the monkey trials. When this is a test case, so it's intentionally breaking the law in order to challenge it. And when it went to trial, the nation just was fascinated. Reporters came from all over the country to watch this, especially because of the lawyers. Representing the banning of teaching evolution, of course, is William Jennings Bryan. And representing John Scopes was a guy named Clarence Darrow, one of the most famous lawyers in the country at the time. He was an atheist, and this is the only time he will work pro bono, or for free. Ironically enough, too, those two were friends. The trial got tons of attention, and it especially took on extra attention when Clarence Darrow challenged William Jennings Bryan to get on the stand himself so they could debate religion itself. That is very unheard of in a trial, but they did it, and the debate that came out of it was just sensational. Everyone was just enthralled with it. Ultimately, John Scopes, the guy who broke the law, he will be found guilty and have to pay a small fine, which of course was paid for him. But this trial especially, Darrow, while he was cross-examining Bryan, he made Bryan look bad. And it's not my opinion that Bryan even thought it was a mistake to get on the stand. And people that watched it said Bryan looked like he just had the life drained out of him because of it. And not long after this, just a few months after the trial, Bryan will actually pass away. Scopes trial and the attempt to ban the teaching of evolution, it really sets the course for religion and science to be seen as antithetical to one another. They don't have to be, and for a lot of history they weren't. But it is what has made religion and science and academia in general, a lot of people, to think that they are completely at odds with each other and that the differences are unbridgeable. Ultimately, it is a loss for all of us. They don't have to be, and it is a battle that we see to this day, which is incredibly unfortunate. The third and last part of this was the rise of the second KKK. There had been a first KKK during Reconstruction, but it had died out. During the 1920s, we get the rise of the second KKK. And it actually started in 1915. A guy named William J. Simmons, he went to the top of Stone Mountain in Georgia, burnt a cross on Thanksgiving evening in 1915, and ushered in the second KKK. So it started in 1915, but it will really take off in the 1920s. If you've ever been here, one of the biggest bagpipe competitions in the nation happens at Stone Mountain, Georgia in October. It's a beautiful place. The carvings, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, it was carved by the same guy that carved Mount Rushmore. Now, the second KKK was completely different than the first, and they were different in all sorts of ways. So the first KKK, it was specifically during Reconstruction, and they targeted freedmen, the freed blacks, and Republicans to try to get them to not vote. So it was very political, and it was specifically targeted at those groups. So the second KKK, in contrast, they were more open-minded in who they hated. You'd say they were more equal opportunity, more diverse in who they hated. They hated everyone. They hated blacks, they hated Jews, they hated Catholics, they hated Irish, they hated Polish, they hated Italians, anyone that was an immigrant. The only people they did not hate were white, Anglo-Saxon, heterosexual Protestants born in the United States. That was important. They called themselves Native Americans. Of course, they hated the people, the real Native Americans. They also hated people from India. So they just hated everyone. So that is a big difference. Also, first KKK was just in the southern United States, just during Reconstruction. The second KKK was national. They had branches in every state in the Union. So they were everywhere. It was national. It wasn't just relegated to the South, and it was more mainstream too. The first KKK, they hid in the shadows. They rode with hoods on so they couldn't be identified, and they did that because they didn't want repercussions. The second KKK, it is incredibly public and open. So instead of just hiding in the shadows, they were really open about being members of the KKK, and they included like people, clergymen, businessmen, store owners, accountants, lawyers. They included principals, superintendents. Depending on where you were, there would be signs in windows saying, "I'm a member of the KKK." They even have a massive parade in Washington, D.C., and some of them will march with their masks off. So they did not hide in the shadows. They were very open. They would have recruiting booths where they would try to recruit people. There were places, like the headquarters for the second KKK was Dallas, Texas, and there were people that joined just because it was almost like a social organization. People that were like, if you wanted to get business in the city, you almost had to. So it was vastly different for that reason. And most importantly, the first KKK had very specific political ends. Stopped blacks and Republicans from voting in order to bring Redeemer governments back. The second KKK, they were preoccupied with upholding Christian morals, Christian values, and combating the cultural changes. And they had an obsessive defense of white women. They always talked about defending white women and Christian values. So obviously they were very religious fundamentalists, and they were very nativist. They were also very much in favor of prohibition, and they talked about especially combating the decline in church attendance and the broad-mindedness of college students and the changes that were cultural changes that were especially centered in cities. So second KKK was vastly different from the first, and they will grow and be really big and politically really powerful and important in a lot of places. They will elect senators. Texas elects a senator that's an avowed Klansman. They elect governors. The state of Indiana had 250,000 Klansmen, which meant 1/3 of the population of Indiana was part of the Klan. It had the most per capita of any state. By 1925, at its height, it had 5 million members. So it was really big. And just as quickly as it took off, it will die out. almost just as fast. And it died out for some very good reasons. For one, being equal opportunity haters and trying to uphold uphold values, they were violent to the wrong people. When I say the wrong people, I mean they would not shy away from inflicting violence on middle-class whites if those middle-class whites were doing things that they deemed immoral. So there were a lot of cases of like husband commits adultery, they bring the husband out into the street, flog him. There were tarring and feathering, but of middle-class whites. And that did not sit well with a lot of Klansmen that were middle-class whites themselves. So that really, their violence was off-putting to a lot of people. The violence to the wrong kind of people made their middle-class constituents turn away from them. But also, and this is really important, they were supposed to uphold Christian morals, Christian values. They were against alcohol. They were defending women's purity. And I don't want to shock you guys, but it turns out that they were just as bad as everyone else. They were just as big of hypocrites as everyone else. But they were trying to force their views on everyone else. So when they were hypocritical, it just stood out so much more. And the case that really just destroyed their reputation was what happened in Indiana. In Indiana, the Grand Dragon, the Klan has weird names. It was like the Grand Wizard, Grand Dragon. It's very Harry Potter sounding stuff. But the Grand Dragon of Indiana is a guy named David Curtis Stevenson. And he was incredibly powerful. He was in charge of 22 states, the Klan in 22 states. And he was nationally prominent. So he was so powerful that he helped elect the governor of the state of Indiana. And he helped elect a lot of important politicians. He was just a very powerful person. One day in 1925, they found a 21-year-old teacher, and a 21-year-old white teacher, and she had been raped and nearly beaten to death. And when I say nearly beaten to death, I mean she had bite marks that were down to the bones all over her. She was almost dead. She was rushed to the hospital. She lived 3 days before she passed away. But in those 3 days, she said who had done this to her. And it was Stevenson. So she lived just long enough to say who had done it. And she had also been plied with liquor. And so the police, they went and checked him out. He had a rail car, like one of those Pullman cars that are super fancy on the inside. And the police raided it, and they found lots of women, lots of blood, and also, of course, lots of liquor. Turns out he had a practice of bringing women into his sleeper car and plying them with alcohol and then having his way with them. White women. Apparently she had tried to reject him, so he had forced her to drink liquor and then raped her and beat her nearly to death. So he was imprisoned. Now, he was so arrogant, he was sure he would get away with this. He was sure that he would get a pardon from the governor. But this gained national attention. Here is a leader of an organization that is meant to protect white women against alcohol, and the level of hypocrisy was so flagrant that everyone just completely cut him off. He sat in jail for a little while, and he made threats. He actually said, I'm going to be pardoned, and if I'm not, I'm going to bring this whole thing down with me. And when he wasn't pardoned, he spoke. He called a journalist, and he released all the information he had. And it turns out the KKK was just an incredibly corrupt organization. In all sorts of ways. They would buy off politicians, but also it was a pyramid scheme. So like if you recruited other people into the Klan, people recruited in had to pay $10 dues, and whoever recruited them in would get like a $4 or $5 of that, and the rest would go to the national headquarters. And so it was like a pyramid scheme, but also they made a ton of money selling those, white hats and the robes and stuff like that. So it was economically corrupt besides being morally corrupt as well. It led to a wave of indictments and a bunch of people going to jail, and it marked the end of the second KKK, not the complete end. The KKK is still around, but obviously just not nearly as powerful. What this all boils down to, though, if all of this seems familiar, these are the culture wars, started in the 1920s, that they've ebbed and flowed, and they continue to this day. Fundamentally, what it is about is change, innovation, versus tradition. And the big dividing line, which is the single biggest indicator of even our politics today, is sectional or regional, urban versus rural. That is a key factor in the culture wars that continue from then till today. And it all comes down to this hyper-individualism. All of these things. Believing that you should force everyone else not to drink. You have to be very individualistic to put that in everyone else. White nationalism, black nationalism, doesn't matter what color you are, nationalism is toxic individualism. But I'm not saying all of it's bad, but everything I just mentioned, all of it comes back to this sense that everyone just wanted to do what they wanted to do. Sometimes they wanted to force it onto other people, but the sheer amount of change, it was just overwhelming. And culture wars, something that has gone on from then until, it varies, but we are going through a period of very intense culture wars that has its roots in the 1920s.